Hello and welcome. I am Tootight Lautrec, the Master Mistress of Glitterature Alley, and here I am once again, and here you are once again too, at the bottom of the down staircase in the permanently sequestered remainder section of an unnamed local library, which may or may not have two pensive lions on the front steps looking back on their very long lives filled with ups and with downs, very much like the main character in this week's selection of Pulitzer Who, Journey in the Dark by Martin Flavin, which won the 1944 Pulitzer Prize for the novel. If you hear some whirring and gurring outside or on your screens, it's not my stomach. It's simply the workmen re-bedazzling literature. So just ignore it if you can. So, we have bypassed the 1943 Pulitzer Prize for the novel winner, Upton Sinclair, for his novels Dragon's Teeth, because it seems that he or that other ubiquitous Sinclair Lewis, turns up every year in the people who have published novels since the beginning of the Pulitzers were started. So, we'll politely wave to both Sinclairs and move right along to Journey in the Dark, Martin Flavin's book, which won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel in 1944. But before we do that, let's look at some other books that were published in 1943 that did not win the Pulitzer Prize for the novel. And those would include At Heaven's Gate by Robert Penn Warren, The Big Rock Candy Mountain by Wallace Stegner, Double Indemnity by James M. Cain, Gideon Plainish by, surprise, surprise, Sinclair Lewis. See what I'm saying about the Sinclairs? The Human Comedy by William Saroyan, The Looking Glass by William March, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith, The Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles, and Wide is the Gate by, you guessed it, Upton Sinclair. But the 1944 Pulitzer Prize for the novel goes to Journey in the Dark by Martin Flavin. So, Martin Flavin was born November 2nd, 1883, and he lived until December 2nd, 1967. He was a playwright and a novelist, and Journey in the Dark won the 1943 Harper's Prize, which was a $10,000 prize, which was, the best prize in literature at that point. The Pulitzer, I guess, hadn't gotten up there in terms of the rank. But then he won the 1944 Pulitzer Prize for the novel, too. He was born in San Francisco. He grew up in Chicago, and he served as a cavalryman in World War I, and then worked as a reporter later on in Chicago, and then stopped doing that to take over the family business, which was a wallpaper company. And while he was at the wallpaper company, on the side, he wrote plays, which it turns out ended up many of them being produced on Broadway. So not a terrible side gig for Martin Flavin. He wrote 5 novels and over a dozen plays and screenplays. Journey in the Dark was his 3rd novel, and it is a rags to riches story of one Sam Braden, who is born to a shiftless father and an industrious but still poor, loving mother in a small town in Iowa at the beginning of the 20th century. So Sam Braden is born poor, and it turns out poverty bites. After suffering many, many degradations of the poor while watching the wealthier neighbors of the town flourish, one of whom he is desperately in love with, a girl named Eileen Wyatt. After watching those wealthy people from his vantage of poverty, Sam vows that he will slowly and steadily rise above the poverty into which he was born. And rise he does indeed do, eventually becoming a man with over $6 million over the course of the novel. And this is a sweeping novel that runs through World War I, the sinking of the Titanic, the Great Depression, and World War II. all of which seem to have had very little impact on Sam's solid decision-making abilities and his eventual rise to wealth. He made very good decisions all throughout these turbulent times. But we are treated to a multitude of sea changes in his emotional landscape. Despite his steady demeanor, he has had quite a few ups and downs emotionally. So during his slow, steady rise to wealth, there are several notable emotional situations, beginning with his attraction to a servant girl who is black named Cassie that tortures him, but that goes nowhere emotionally. And then on top of that, his attraction to the rich girl across town, Eileen Wyatt, who is a distant beauty who seems to be, unfortunately for Sam, more in love with her cousin Neil Wyatt than she is with Sam. So after Neil Wyatt marries one of Eileen's friends, Eileen seems to be distraught, but you can't really tell because she's kind of a cold fish. Sam finds his chance, and Sam and Eileen finally marry. But it turns out it is not a success for either couple. Both couples, it turns out, separate. Neil goes off to Europe. Sam stays home while Eileen follows Neil to Europe, where she promptly gets pregnant by Neil and belatedly divorces Sam. So Sam's all broken up about this, but it turns out he ends up marrying another younger girl who, it turns out, makes him happy for the first time in his entire life. And they have a son, and the story could end happily ever after there. And it would be a very good story. But instead, more things happen. And I won't detail what those things are because this book is less about what happens in it than it is about the emotional burdens and the joys that surround Sam as he goes through his slow and steady rise to riches. And he goes through what many people go through. He goes through hopes, dreams, loves, losses, successes, disappointments. And what interested me most in this book is not what happens in it, but it's the way in which Flavin tells the story and the way in which he deals with time in the narrative. One example is that on page 14, at the very beginning of the book, we already know that Sam is rich and he's coming home to visit his sister Madge in the house that he bought for her. And he's there for the first time in a long time with his wealthy self and his rich car. And we also know that we find out that Cassie, the girl that we learn a little bit more about later on, has been hired to be the housekeeper. So we get this on page 14. He walked up the path and pulled the bell, waiting with a vague sense of discomfort and depression. Cassie Cole came to the door as he had thought she would. Still, it always made him feel uncomfortable at first. "Oh, it's you," she said, respectfully and surprised, smiling at him from the darkness in the hall. He had noticed that she never used his name if she could help it. She was light-skinned like her mother, slender and still pretty. "Hello, Cassie." Madge had hired her, first asking his permission, and how could he object? Damn it all, he thought, as he had thought many times, what difference does it make? Bygones are bygones. And so this is our first glimpse of Cassie Cole, and we don't exactly know what's going on at this point, but Flavin sets us up for something about Cassie, and we wait for it with anticipation until we finally figure out what happens a little bit later. But that sentence, bygones be bygones, we know that there's some discomfort here between Sam and Cassie. And Flavin does this continually throughout the novel. He sets his narrative eye forward and backward in time, and I found it rather satisfying the way that he did it. And I don't generally like these wide-ranging narratives that cover an entire life. I prefer narratives that cover about a year or so in a life. But many reviewers of this book have called it tepid and not all that interesting in terms of the things that happen in it. And I can see that. But, and I think you know just what kind of a but that is, these comments about not being interested in the common events of a common life seem to me to miss the point entirely. I found Flavin's structuring of the novel quite artful in terms of the way that he doles out information to capture our attention, to hint at something that may come later, and then to fulfill our expectations in a way that seems unremarkable and seems quite natural, but is yet quite satisfying. For instance, we do find out just what happens and why Sam feels so strange around Cassie on page 58. So from page 14 to 58, we don't exactly know what goes on. He glances at it slightly as we go along, but we don't have to wait too long to figure out what happened. So it's an emotionally full novel, and I feel that I do believe that it's very well written. Sam Braden's life, like all of our lives, is a journey in the dark. We grope forward, hoping and striving, and hoping that we have some sort of control over the events in our lives, but turns out we don't have as much as we want or as much as we would hope. And I was caught up in the emotional life of Sam Braden the entire way. Now, last week I talked about a blog by a guy who calls himself Great Books Guy, and he hated the book that I liked, and he hated this book as well. And I will have to say, though, that this Great Books Guy, his mission is to read every single one of the Pulitzer Prize winners for the novel. And I'm just going to say, I think that he may be reading a little too quickly, because it seems that he missed the entire point of this novel and found it tedious. But he also, in his summary, I see that he makes a rather glaring error about one of the points in the plot. And so if Great Books Guy ever mistakenly tunes into this channel, I would advise him to maybe slow down a little bit in your reading. It's not, you know, we all have projects that we want to get through, but it's better to go slowly and to maybe find what joy you can as you're doing it, and that way you won't miss some of the plot points. So just a little hint there for what others might do. So what kept me reading and what stopped me reading? I found these little pockets of emotional situations that he sets up to entice us and then slowly reveal what happens in the end kept me going situation after situation until the very end. Occasionally, I found the toing and the froing backward and forward in narrative time got me a little lost. Sometimes I didn't know if it was a backflash or a front flash, if you can call it that. And I don't always mind that. But I didn't always exactly know where we were in the novel, and so eventually I would have to refocus and find my footing again. But I kept going. Do I have some qualms? I do have some qualms. There's a hint at racism here, which partially his dealing with Cassie and his inability, Sam Braden's inability to follow through emotionally with her. And there's some deeply buried, but maybe not strongly held anti-Semitism as well. But I felt that both of these were instances of complications of an imperfect, flawed character of Sam Braden rather than propensities within the author, Martin Flavin. And so I found them to be well-placed and pertinent to the story. So I have overlooked them. Do I recommend it? Yes, I do. I recommend it. It may not be the best book that I've ever read, but it's an emotional rags to riches story with ups and downs, the story of an ordinary man's ordinary life told in evocative prose in the way that I feel captures the wonder of small things. And I think by this point, we all know how I feel about wonder. Pay attention. I am Tootight Lautrec. Until we meet again. Mwah.